September 16th, 1928. South Florida. 8:47 p.m. The screen opens on a still, flat horizon. The last copper light of dusk hangs low over the sugarcane fields south of Lake Okeechobee. Children are being called inside for dinner. A mother hums while she sets the table. Chickens settle into their coops. Somewhere, a dog barks once and then goes silent. The communities stretched across the black soil south of the Great Lake are places built by hand. Pahokee, Belglade, South Bay, Canal Point. Towns that did not exist 20 years earlier, carved from swamp and prairie by workers who came looking for a new life. Mostly black farm workers and their families, Seminole communities, white settlers, all drawn to the most fertile farmland in America. Tonight, more than 50,000 people live in this flat, low basin. Most of them in wooden homes. Most of them no more than 5 feet above sea level. Most of them trusting in a dirt dike that lines the southern shore of a lake containing more water than any other freshwater body in the United States, east of the Mississippi. By midnight, that dike will collapse. By dawn, the lake itself will be gone. Not drained, but moved. A wall of dark water 12 feet high will swallow entire towns in under an hour. Houses will disappear. Families will vanish. The bodies of more than 2,500 human beings will be carried across the fields like debris. They had no warning. They had no higher ground. They had nowhere to go. This is not a story about a storm. It is a story about the choices made before the storm arrived, and what happened when those choices ran out of time. The richest dirt in the world. To understand what was lost that night, you first have to understand what had been built. The land south of Lake Okeechobee was called the Glades. For centuries, it had been considered worthless, a shallow, flooded wilderness of sawgrass and alligators. Then, in the early 1900s, engineers came with machines, shovels, and a dream of draining the swamp and selling it as farmland. The water was pulled back. Black muck soil, ancient, deep, extraordinarily rich, was exposed. And the word spread quickly. This was some of the most productive agricultural land on Earth. Tomatoes, peppers, beans, and sugarcane grew here in abundance. The growing season was nearly year-round. Laborers arrived by the thousands, from Georgia, South Carolina, Alabama, and the Bahamas. Small towns erupted from the flatness almost overnight. Belglade incorporated in 1928. At the same year, it would be destroyed. Pahokee had a bank, a newspaper, and a school. Canal Point had churches, stores, and warehouses. The farms were big business, and the towns that served them were proud, growing, and alive with energy. The community along the southern shore was young. Many of the buildings were less than a decade old, but it had the confidence of a place that had beaten nature. They had drained the swamp. They had tamed the glades. The dike that held back Lake Okeechobee was, in the eyes of most residents, more than adequate. The lake was calm. The muck was rich. The future was enormous. Nobody believed the land would take them back. Nobody believed the lake would return. They had won, and the harvest proved it every single year. They were wrong in the most devastating way imaginable. To the dike, that was never enough. The dike was called the Okeechobee Levee, but calling it a levee gave it more dignity than it deserved. It was, in engineering terms, a mound of compacted muck and sand, earthen, poorly designed, and built largely by hand labor with no internal core of rock or concrete. In some stretches, it stood no more than 5 feet tall. In others, it was barely wider than a road. Engineers and scientists had raised concerns about the dike's structural integrity for years. As early as 1920, surveys showed that the southern portion of the levee was dangerously inadequate to contain the lake in the event of a major storm surge. Lake Okeechobee sits, on average, 15 feet above sea level. The communities on its southern shore sit at 4 to 6 feet. The arithmetic of catastrophe required no advanced degree to understand. But in 1926, after a hurricane struck the Miami area and caused enormous damage, the Army Corps of Engineers and Florida state officials had focused their attention on the Atlantic coast. The Glades communities continued to lobby for a stronger dike, but the federal budget was limited and the political will was fragile. The landowners, powerful agricultural interests, did not want to see development slowed. The dike would hold, they insisted. It had held before. In August 1928, a state inspector examined the southern dike. He filed a report noting that several sections were insufficiently reinforced. His report was received, logged, and filed away. "The lake will not rise that high," a county official was reported as saying. "We've seen storms before. The people who lived behind that dike believed him. They had no reason not to. Born over the Atlantic, the San Felipe hurricane, the storm that would become the Okeechobee hurricane, was first detected on September 6, 1928, as a tropical disturbance near the Cape Verde Islands off the west coast of Africa. Weather forecasters of the era had no satellites, no radar, and no aircraft to track storms in the open ocean. Their tools were barometers, ship reports, and radio messages, a patchwork of incomplete information stitched together by instinct as much as science. The disturbance organized rapidly, drawing energy from the warm, late-summer Atlantic. By September 10th, it had become a full hurricane. On September 13th, it had made landfall on the island of Guadeloupe in the Lesser Antilles, with winds estimated at 160 miles per hour. The destruction was immediate and total. More than 1,200 people were killed in the Caribbean islands before the storm had even set its sights on the United States. Puerto Rico was devastated. The storm struck the island on September 13th, killing more than 300 people and leaving hundreds of thousands homeless. The U.S. Weather Bureau issued bulletins. Florida received official warnings that a major hurricane was tracking northwest and would likely strike the southeastern part of the state. Coastal communities in Miami and Palm Beach were advised to prepare. Evacuations were ordered for low-lying coastal areas. But in the Glades, 40 miles inland from the coast, the response was muddled. Many residents received word of the approaching storm only hours before it arrived. Others received no word at all. Some families in Belle Glade and Pahokee later recalled hearing rumors of a storm coming. A few left. Most stayed. They had survived the 1926 hurricane. They believed this would be the same. A hard night of wind and rain, followed by morning. The storm had other intentions. Sunday morning, September 16th. The morning of September 16th, 1928 was warm and overcast. Church services were held across the Glades communities. Men gathered on the porches of general stores talking about the coming week's harvest. Children played in the packed dirt streets between the wooden storefronts of Belle Glade. The air smelled of black soil, sugarcane, and the particular green stillness that precedes a storm. The lake looked different, and some of the older residents noticed it immediately. The water was already pushed to unusual levels by days of onshore winds ahead of the hurricane. The surface had a strange rolling quality, even in the absence of wind. A few fishermen who went out that morning came back quickly, unnerved by the feel of the water without being able to say exactly why. "Something ain't right with the lake," an elderly Bahamian farm worker reportedly told his family at noon. He had lived near large water all his life. He knew its moods. By mid-afternoon, the wind began to pick up from the east. It was not yet alarming, a stiffening breeze, the sky thickening from white, overcast to a solid gray. Children were pulled inside. A few families, heeding the official warnings that had trickled in over the radio and telephone, packed bags and drove north on the unpaved roads. The roads were not built for evacuation. Most people stayed. By dusk, the wind was constant and strong, the trees bending south, the surface of the lake invisible behind rising spray. The electricity in Belle Glade flickered and went out. Families huddled in their wooden homes in the dark, listening to the wind build. None of them knew that the lake had already begun to move. The water is rising. By 9 o'clock that evening, the wind had become something different. It was no longer a storm sound. It had become a physical force that pressed against the walls of houses, found every gap in the siding, screamed through the palmetto trees in long, continuous notes of alarm. The rain was horizontal, indistinguishable from the wind, both of them arriving from the east with the flat relentlessness of something that had traveled a very long distance. Inside their homes, families pressed together in the dark. Candles blew out the moment they were lit. Children cried. Men braced doors with their bodies. Women held infants wrapped in whatever cloth they had. The wooden structures shook, groaned, creaked in rhythms that sounded organic, animal, like something alive and afraid. Then, around 10 o'clock, people began to notice something that had nothing to do with the wind. Water was coming in under their doors. Not rain, not runoff from the streets. Something heavier, darker, rising steadily from below. It was cold. It smelled of lake mud and dead vegetation. It rose past the threshold, over the floor, around their ankles, and kept climbing. The hurricane's winds, me driving from the northeast across the length of the lake for hours, had pushed an enormous body of water against the southern shore. Lake Okeechobee, 40 miles wide, had been transformed by the storm into a battering ram. All of that momentum, all of that mass, was pressing directly against the earthen dike. Survivors would later say they could feel the vibration through the floorboards. A deep, low shudder like something enormous groaning underground. That was the sound of the dike, beginning to fail. Cut off from the world. The telephone lines went down at approximately 10:15 p.m. The roads leading north out of the glades had been flooding since early evening. By now, the unpaved routes to Palm Beach and the coast were under a foot of moving water. Invisible in the darkness, indistinguishable from the surrounding flatness. As vehicles stalled, engines drowned. People who had set out to drive to safety found themselves stranded in their cars in the middle of what had been a road and was now part of the landscape of water. There would be no rescue tonight. No one outside the glades knew yet what was happening inside it. The Weather Bureau in Miami had tracked the hurricane's eye as it came ashore near Palm Beach, 40 miles to the east, and their attention was on the coast. The inland communities were beyond the immediate concern of official eyes. The radio broadcast that went out at 10 o'clock advised people in coastal areas to remain in strong structures. For the thousands of people already waist-deep in lake water 15 miles south of the dike, that advice was meaningless. Families who tried to flee on foot found the darkness absolute. And the stars and moon were obliterated by the storm. There were no streetlights. The familiar landscape of fields, canals, drainage ditches, roads had been erased under moving black water. Men who knew every inch of the land they farmed for years stepped off the edges of drainage canals they could no longer see and disappeared. The great flatness of the glades, which had once seemed like abundance, limitless, open, rich, had become a trap. There was no hill to climb, no ridge to reach, no high ground within miles. The people of the glades were alone with the lake. The dike breaks. The exact moment the dike failed is not recorded. What is known from the testimony of survivors and the physical evidence left behind is that by approximately 11 p.m., several sections of the southern levee had given way simultaneously. The lake did not leak through. It did not seep. It erupted. The wall of water that came south was, by estimates based on the flood line it left on trees and buildings, between 12 and 15 feet high at its leading edge. It moved at the speed of a slow-running river, not fast enough to outrun, but too fast to react to in the darkness. It carried everything the lake had accumulated. Logs, debris, the remains of fishing boats, mud, vegetation, and water. Millions upon millions of gallons of water, moving as a single mass across the flat land. The wooden houses of the communities directly south of the dike, many of them home to black farm worker families who lived closest to the lake, were struck first. The structures were not built to resist that kind of force. They did not bend. They did not crack. They simply ceased to exist as recognizable structures. Walls blew apart, roofs lifted, floors dissolved. Everything inside, furniture, clothing, food, tools, the accumulation of a family's entire life, was taken up into the dark current and carried south across the fields. People who were inside those houses were thrown into water that was cold, fast-moving, and completely dark. They grabbed for anything solid, roof beams, tree branches, fence posts, the bodies of other people. Many found nothing. The sound was reported by survivors as a roar, not the roar of the wind, but a deeper sound, a bass vibration that filled the chest and the body, the sound of the entire lake moving at once. In Belglade, the water arrived in the downtown area within minutes of the dike breach. Businesses, the post office, the small hotel, buildings that had stood as symbols of the town's ambition and prosperity, were engulfed. Glass shattered. Walls fell. The town's water tower toppled. The mud beneath the streets liquefied. For thousands of people in the glades that night, the world they had known simply stopped existing. The lake devours the land. The hurricane's eye passed over the glades between midnight and 2 in the morning. For a brief, surreal interval, the wind died. The roaring stopped. Stars appeared. Survivors who had made it to rooftops or had climbed trees looked out across a landscape they could not recognize. An enormous, still black lake extending in every direction, lit dimly by stars with the ruins of houses and the crowns of palmettos breaking the surface. Some people, believing the storm was over, descended from their refuges, and they were wrong. The eye passed and the back wall of the hurricane struck with the same ferocity as the first. But now the winds came from the opposite direction, northwest, and they drove the water back northward, creating a second surge that moved through the communities from a new angle, striking buildings weakened by the first assault, creating currents that spun in unpredictable directions through the debris-choked flood. People who had survived the first surge now faced the second, in conditions that had become unimaginably worse. The water was full of wreckage. Jagged wood with exposed nails, sheet metal, barbed wire from torn fences, dead animals, collapsed structures, all of it moving in the dark. People were lacerated, people were pinned. Yet people drowned in 4 feet of water because they were tangled in debris they could not see. A survivor named Lawrence Will, who later wrote the only detailed first-hand account of the disaster, described clinging to the roof of a small houseboat with dozens of others as the current swept them across fields that had been dry land hours before. People fell from the roof with each lurch and jolt. Some were pulled back up. Most were not. He could hear voices in the water around him, crying, calling names, praying. And then, one by one, the voices stopped. In the community of Chosin, an entire neighborhood was swept from the map. In South Bay, families who had climbed to their second floors drowned when the water reached the roofline. In Pahokee, the bodies of children were found in the sugarcane fields half a mile from any house. When the storm lasted through the night, the water did not begin to recede until the following afternoon. By then, the glades had become something that had no name. Not a lake, not land, not a community. A still, brown flatness under a clear sky, with wreckage as far as the eye could see, and a silence so complete that survivors described it as the loudest thing they had ever heard. The hurricane of 1928 killed between 2,500 and 3,000 people in the glades alone. Many historians believe the true number was never determined, because the communities hardest hit were the poorest and least documented. Farm workers, many of them black, many of them recent immigrants, many of them seasonal and unknown to official records. They were counted last, incompletely, and in many cases, not at all. To this day, no definitive death toll exists. The lake swallowed a number that history could never fully recover. Ruby and her brothers. Among the tens of thousands of people who lived south of the lake were Ruby Dillon and her family. Ruby was 11 years old. She lived with her mother, her grandmother, and her 3 younger brothers in a wooden house on the edge of Bell Glade. Her father had gone north that summer to look for work and had not yet returned. Her mother, Addie, was 27 years old. She had come from Georgia 6 years before because a cousin had told her the black soil grew everything. Addie had heard the radio warnings on Saturday. She had considered leaving, but she had no car. The wagon horse had gone lame, and the nearest shelter she knew of was in Palm Beach, 40 miles away, across roads that were already flooding. She had survived the 1926 storm in the same house. She made the decision that thousands of others made. They would stay together and wait it out. When the water began rising on Sunday night, Addie tied her children to herself and to each other with lengths of rope she had kept in the kitchen. When the surge struck the house, the structure collapsed within seconds. All 5 of them were taken into the water. Ruby survived. She was carried by the current into a stand of Australian pine trees at the edge of a farm field, where she found purchase on a branch and held through the night. In the morning, she was found by a man in a rowboat, barely conscious, still wearing the remnants of the rope her mother had tied around her waist. She never found her mother or her grandmother. One of her brothers was found alive 2 days later, 3 miles away, in a drainage canal. The other 2 were never recovered. Ruby Dillon's story is not exceptional. It is representative. Across the glades that night, hundreds of families were separated in the same darkness, in the same water, making the same desperate decisions with the same inadequate tools. Most did not get a rope. Most did not get a tree. September 17th, a new geography. Dawn on September 17th revealed a landscape that bore no resemblance to what had existed 24 hours before. The sky was clear, the wind was gone. The air had the scrubbed, sharp clarity that comes after a major storm, a brightness that felt obscene against what lay beneath it. The floodplain of the southern glades was covered in brown, shallow, slowly moving water, dotted with the remnants of houses, walls, roof sections, whole rooms that had been carried from their foundations and deposited at random across the flatness. Sugarcane fields that had stood 6 feet tall were crushed flat, layered with silt and debris. The roads had ceased to exist as navigable surfaces. The towns were gone. Survivors moved through this landscape in silence or in shock. Some sat on the wreckage of their homes and said nothing. Some walked in circles, calling names. Some searched the debris with their hands, not looking for valuables, not looking for practical items, looking for their children, their parents, their husbands and wives. In many cases, they found them. In many cases, they did not. The bodies were everywhere, caught in the wire fences that had once bordered farm fields, lying in the shallow water of drainage ditches, draped across the collapsed beams of destroyed houses, in the trees, in the road, distributed across the land with a randomness that was the most terrible thing of all. There was no logic to who had survived and who had not, no virtue or strength or wisdom that had made the difference. The water had taken whom it took. By the morning of September 17th, rescue parties from Palm Beach and West Palm Beach were attempting to reach the glades, but the roads were impassable. The outside world would not fully reach the survivors for another 24 to 48 hours. The people of the glades were still alone, now among the dead. The heat and the dead September in South Florida is the height of the wet season. The temperature rises quickly after dawn. By mid-morning on September 17th, the air temperature was over 90 degrees, the humidity crushing, the sun blazing on a landscape covered in standing water and thousands of unrecovered bodies. The decomposition of human bodies in tropical heat begins within hours. Within 2 days of the disaster, the smell that reached rescue workers entering the glades from the north was described in contemporary accounts as overwhelming. A dense, organic, pervasive smell that clung to clothing and skin and did not leave. Workers who entered the flood zone for the first time vomited. Some refused to go further. The public health crisis was immediate and dire. There was no refrigeration. There was no embalming capacity anywhere near sufficient for the scale of what had occurred. The bodies of the dead, most of them farm workers, most of them black, were collected by work gangs, some composed of men working at gunpoint under the authority of the Florida National Guard. The official policy, driven by speed and by the racial hierarchies of Jim Crow Florida, was brutal in its inequity. White victims were placed in individual coffins and transported to cemeteries. Black victims were buried in mass graves, 2 large trenches dug on the outskirts of Belle Glade, or burned in funeral pyres in the open fields. Hundreds of victims were never identified. Hundreds more were never officially recorded. The mass graves were not marked. For decades, no monument acknowledged them. The disparity in how the dead were treated became, in the years that followed, one of the most haunting dimensions of the disaster, a second erasure imposed by the living upon those the water had already taken, not what was built. After the lake spoke within weeks of the disaster, the political pressure for action became impossible to ignore. The Hoover Dike, named for Herbert Hoover, who visited the glades in the aftermath of the storm as Secretary of Commerce and was moved by the scale of the destruction, was authorized by Congress in 1930 and completed over the following decade. The new structure was a massive engineering achievement, a 30-foot-tall earthen dike, reinforced with concrete, stretching more than 100 miles around Lake Okeechobee. It would be tested by multiple hurricanes in subsequent decades and would hold. The communities of the glades were rebuilt, more slowly than the dike and with less federal money. Belle Glade and Pahokee rose again from the muck, their new buildings made of concrete block rather than wood. The agricultural economy recovered within a few years, fueled by the same black soil that had drawn the workers in the first place. By the mid-1930s, it was possible to pass through the region and see little physical evidence of what had happened. But the human landscape had changed. Thousands of families who had survived the storm left and never returned. The communities lost a generation of workers, farmers, and residents who could not bring themselves to live beneath the same sky, beside the same lake. The population south of Okeechobee declined sharply in the years following the disaster and did not fully recover for more than 2 decades. The economic impact extended far beyond the glades. The disruption of the agricultural supply chain, the loss of farmland productivity, and the cost of Reconstruction together represented a staggering blow to a region already struggling in the early years of the Great Depression. The storm had taken more than lives. It had taken a future that had been confidently assumed. There is a place in Belle Glade, Florida, where a small monument now stands near the mass graves of the 1928 hurricane victims. For decades, there was no monument. The graves were unmarked, overgrown, and forgotten by everyone except the descendants of those buried there. The first permanent memorial was not dedicated until 2003, 75 years after the storm. 75 years. The Okeechobee hurricane of 1928 is not well remembered in American history. Not the way Galveston is remembered, not the way Katrina is remembered. It does not appear in most standard history textbooks. The reasons for this are not mysterious. The people who died in the greatest numbers were poor. They were black. They were immigrant. They were seasonal workers without permanent addresses, without official records, without the kind of social and political capital that generates collective memory and public monuments. But the storm itself, the mechanics of it, the human choices embedded in it, are as relevant today as they were in 1928. We still build communities below sea level. We still trust earthen barriers between ourselves and enormous bodies of water. We still make decisions about infrastructure based on cost and politics and the assumption that a disaster of that scale will not happen again in our lifetime. We still systematically undercount the deaths of the poor and the marginalized when catastrophe arrives. The lake does not make those distinctions. The water does not check for permits. The surge does not care about the political convenience of the moment. The 1928 hurricane did not reveal nature's indifference. It revealed our own. And in every generation since, we have had the choice to remember that, or to wait for the water to teach us again.